Today's headline is the first America's Sweetheart. This article was written by Elmo Scott Watson. It says, the mention of rifles and Buffalo Bill and other romantic things caused more than one boy to read carefully that notice of Annie Oakley's death. It caused a question which would have never been thought of 30 years ago, but today, Pop, who was Annie Oakley, came the query in many a home when the short dispatch made known the fact that little Missy was gone. And in many a home, an interrogated father halted in his reading. The room had faded. In its place, a great amphitheater stretched in a vastness of distance, of flying forms, of scenery, of throng-packed tiers of seats. At one side, there waved and nodded the eagle-plumed headdresses of the representatives of the Sioux, the Kiowa, the Comanche, and the Cheyenne. Yonder, a stalwart man in flowing hair and straight-brushed goatee, his buckskin coat fitting snug over massive shoulders, rode like a god upon his prancing horse. Farther away, the old Deadwood stagecoach awaited the cue for the daily encounter with the deadly aborigine of mountain and plain. And right out there, less than a score of feet away, shooting against Johnny Baker for the championship of the Wild West. Who was Annie Oakley, as many have fathered that night? She was my first sweetheart, son. Thus does Courtney Riley Cooper end his book Annie Oakley, Woman at Arms, a biography published by Duffield and Company of New York this year. A book which will recall to many of us that glamorous period of our youth when the visit of Buffalo Bill's Wild West show was an annual event, to be looked forward to almost as much as the 4th of July, Christmas, or the last day of school. Circus Day is not included in that list of red-letter days for a very obvious reason. There was more than one circus. But there was only one Buffalo Bill and one Buffalo Bill show. And there never was, and never will be again, but one Annie Oakley, Little Miss Shoreshot, undoubtedly the greatest markswoman in history. Cooper is right in having many a father that night say to his son, she was my first sweetheart. For long before the screen placed the face of Mary Pickford before the eyes of millions of Americans, this girl, born August 13, 1866, who was christened Phoebe Ann Oakley Mozzie, and who was destined to make the shortened form of her name, Annie Oakley, known throughout the world, had won the right to the title of the first America's Sweetheart. There is more than one reason why Annie Oakley has an enduring claim to that title. Although not all of these reasons were generally known at the height of her popularity, her biography shows that young America did not guess wrong in making her his sweetheart and offering to her such a full measure of admiration and devotion. The life story of Annie Oakley is a combination Cinderella fairy story, frontier melodrama, albeit a clean melodrama, and a sort of female Horatio Alger rise to fame yarn. The Cinderella part of it begins with the pioneer home near a small crossroads settlement in Darke County, Ohio, where in a little log cabin lived Jake Mozzie and his wife, whom as a 12-year-old child he had rescued from a brutal stepfather in Pennsylvania. He had given her a home with his sister, and after marrying her when she was 15, set out with her to make a new home in the Ohio country. In this new home, Mozzie and his wife fought a constant battle with privation and poverty. Then Mozzie, returning from the mill, was frozen to death in a blizzard, and upon the mother fell the whole task of providing for her 7 children. At the age of 6, Annie began helping fill the family larder by trapping quail, and a few years later, she had made the first start on the rifle career that was to make her famous. One of the few possessions which Jake Mozzie had brought with him from Pennsylvania was a 40-inch cap and ball Kentucky rifle which hung over the fireplace, but which had never been used because Mozzie was a Quaker, with the Quaker prejudice against firearms. The tomboy Annie, however, did not share that prejudice. She saw in the weapon an instrument for getting more food for her brothers and sisters, and finally gained her mother's reluctant consent. But the beginning of her career as a markswoman was soon interrupted. She went to the county infirmary to get a chance to attend school, and while there, a stranger appeared and offered to take one of the girls at the infirmary to work for her, board and keep. Annie was the girl selected, and in the home of this man began her Cinderella existence. The man was a brute, and his wife a virago. Annie was held as a virtual slave, subjected to all sorts of cruel treatment. Once when she fell asleep over a basket of mending, the woman threw her out into a snowstorm half naked. After 2 years of this existence, she finally escaped and returned home. There she continued her former role of provider for the family with the rifle, and thus laid the foundation for the marvelous skill which was to make her world famous. News of her skills spread throughout Dark County, and even to Cincinnati, where hotel keepers had been buying the game which she killed. When Annie was 15, there came to Cincinnati the far-famed team of Butler and Company, performing deeds of daring and dexterity with firearms, seldom exhibited before the eyes of an audience. As a publicity stunt, Frankie Butler was accustomed to issue a challenge to all comers to a shooting match. The challenge was taken up by one of Annie's hotel-keeping patrons, who prevailed upon her to shoot against a professional. The girl not only won the match, but also won the heart of Frank Butler, and a year or so later, they were married. She began taking part in her husband's act, and for some time, they were billed as Butler and Oakley. Then Butler, who was a skillful showman, began giving his wife more and more of the limelight and pushing himself more and more into the background. Within a short time, she was a noted figure in the Eastern theaters. At one time, while they were playing in St. Paul, a delegation of Sioux Indians who were on their way to Washington for a conference with the Great White Father attended the theater where Butler and Oakley were presenting their act. One of the delegation was the famous Sitting Bull, who gave evidence of his approval of the girl's marksmanship when many a waste, which was translated as good. Finally, as she performed her most difficult feat, that of shooting the end from a cigarette held between the teeth of her husband, Sitting Bull arose in great excitement, shouting Montagna Ciclia, Little Sure Shot. Little Sure Shot was the name of one of his daughters who had died, and so greatly was he impressed with Annie Oakley's prowess that he sent an interpreter to her after the show and asked permission to adopt her as his daughter. She consented, and the ceremony took place at the hotel. After that, managers were more eager than ever to book the act of Sitting Bull's adopted daughter. In the meantime, Colonel W.F. Cody, Buffalo Bill, had organized his Wild West show, but the first year had been almost a failure. While it was playing in New Orleans, Frank Butler and Annie Oakley, who were then traveling with a circus, visited the show and decided that they would prefer being a part of this outfit than of the circus. Cody could not afford to pay the salary that Butler asked, so nothing came of it at the time. But the next year, their trails crossed again at Louisville, Kentucky, and Nate Salisbury, Buffalo Bill's partner, who happened to be passing by while Annie and her husband were rehearsing their act, was so impressed by it and its possibilities as a part of his show that he hired them on the spot. So in the year 1885, Annie Oakley joined the Buffalo Bill Wild West show, and there began that series of amazing triumphs which this former Ohio waif was to share with one of the greatest figures the show world has ever known. It was through her influence that another feature was added to the show, which greatly enhanced its popularity. For some time, Buffalo Bill had been trying to induce Sitting Bull to join his company, but the old Sioux leader steadfastly refused. After Annie joined the show, Cody tried again. He sent an interpreter to Sitting Bull with the word that Montana Ciclia was with his show and wanted Sitting Bull to join also. There was no further argument. Sitting Bull came forthwith, and the crowds which turned out to see the reputed leader of the Indians at the Custer Battle, the great buffalo hunter, and the great markswoman increased at every city in which the show appeared. After a successful season of 1886 on Staten Island and in Madison Square Garden, New York, Buffalo Bill began looking around for new worlds to conquer. He found it first in England, where he took his show on the occasion of Queen Victoria's Jubilee in London. It was during this engagement that Annie won her famous shooting match with the Grand Duke Michael of Russia, a match which had been arranged by the Prince of Wales, later Edward VII. 2 years later, Buffalo Bill's Wild West was showing in Paris. Cody had met with financial reverses, and he hoped to recoup his losses in the French capital. But on the grand opening day, with the President of France and other high officials present, it soon became apparent that the show was doomed to be a flop. The French simply couldn't get the meaning of it all. The bucking horses, the mimic warfare between the cowboys and the Indians, whom incidentally they thought were fakes. But when Annie Oakley gave her exhibition of marksmanship, then it was different. Here was something they could understand, and she was given an ovation that a queen might be thrilled over. For the French had never seen such shooting as this. Here are a few of the stunts that she performed. In shooting clay pigeons, she stood 20 feet back of the traps, started with the pulling of the trap, ran the 20 feet, picked up her gun, and broke the pigeon while it was still in the air. Using 3 double-barreled shotguns, she broke 6 glass balls thrown into the air at once. She shot a dime from between her husband's thumb and forefinger at 30 paces. Perhaps the most famous of her stunts was that of shooting the ashes from a cigarette in the mouth of Kaiser Wilhelm, then the Crown Prince of Germany. Had her aim been a little less true, the World War might never have been fought. Annie Oakley ended her career with the Buffalo Bills show in 1901. Then tragedy came into her life again. On the last journey of the season, the show train was wrecked in North Carolina. Annie Oakley was desperately injured, but the same courage that had always carried her through every emergency carried her through 5 operations and years of agony. Although the doctors had said she could never handle a gun again, she staged a comeback, and at Pinehurst, North Carolina, in April 1922, she broke 100 clay targets straight, shooting from 16 yards. Annie Oakley had many other interests besides her shooting. Although at one time she was making $1,000 a week, her estate at her death last year was comparatively small. Perhaps the fact that she supported an educated and adopted family of 18 children, as well as giving generously to many charities, had something to do with that. When the news of her death was flashed from Dayton, Ohio, on November 4, 1926, to revive her name and fame, it also started a discussion as to why free passes to a circus or theater are known universally as Annie Oakley's. In this book, Mr. Cooper gives the origin of the phrase as follows. One of her feats was to place a playing card, the ace of hearts, as a target at a distance of 25 yards. Then, firing 25 shots in 27 seconds, she would obliterate that ace of hearts in the center, leaving only bullet holes in its place. A card thus shot by Annie Oakley formed quite a souvenir in the 80s. There came into being a baseball magnate who looked with some disfavor upon passes, as all baseball managers look upon these avenues of free admission. It's the custom that the door tender may know the ticket to be free, to punch a hole or two in the card, thus saving a miscount when the proceeds of the day were checked. One day a card came to the gate, which had been thoroughly perforated. The magnate remarked laconically, looks like Annie Oakley shot at it. This story came from the great state of Nebraska, being reported in the Potter Review of November 18th, 1927. Thank you for joining us today. If you want to continue to uncover all of America's lost and forgotten history, then remember before you leave to hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and remember to like and comment below. And we will see you next time on Americana Archives.